Stephanie Gilmore, Curator of Collections and Exhibits at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Today, as part of our Small Wonders video series, I'm going to share information and history about railroad switch locks. These specialized locks were once used to secure railroad switches and are today prized by collectors and museum curators alike for their interesting shapes, markings, and makers. Before we explore switch locks, however, it is necessary to understand railroad turnouts and how they work. In the simplest of terms, turnouts, also known as switches, are track mechanisms that change the course of a train from the main track onto different routes or tracks. Switches can change trains between one or more parallel tracks, like for a siding, or they can split one track into two routes, such as at a junction point, or they can also be used at a Y for turning a locomotive or train. There were once two kinds of switches used at turnouts: split switches and stub switches. In a split switch mechanism, the most common today, there is a pair of tapered rails called points placed between the running rails on the main track. The points are hinged at one end and are controlled at the tapered or sharp end by a connecting rod coming from a switch stand, located next to the track. When the switch stand lever is thrown, the rod moves the points from one running rail to the other. As the points move from side to side, a pair of colored plates on the switch stand, known as targets, rotate 90 degrees. These targets are typically painted two different colors, red on both sides for one and green or yellow for the other, which helps rail workers see the current position of the switch. The targets can be seen from either end of the switch, but only one target, and thus color, is visible at any given time. In a stub switch mechanism, which predates the split switch, both the movable rails and the fixed route rails have blunt ends that match together when the mechanism is lined for one of the route options. A target affixed to the switch stand showed train crews which direction the stand was thrown, but it's a bit counterintuitive. Due to the difficulty of precisely aligning the blunt-ended rails and their propensity to misalign because of weather variations, stub switches were far more likely to cause derailments and thus were virtually obsolete by the early 20th century. To illustrate the dangers of tampered with or malfunctioning switches, we found this article from a Cripple Creek newspaper dated August 15, 1900. George Featherstone and Arthur Colvin, each 11 years of age, of Independence and Goldfield, opened the switch yesterday, just beyond the Y between Bull Hill and Cameron on the Midland Terminal, and caused the wreck of the train carrying 15 passengers aboard that leaves this point at 2 for Colorado Springs. A sharp curve prevented Engineer Fenton from seeing the opening until it was too late, but he remained at his post and managed to reverse the engine in time to lighten the shock of crashing into the freight cars sidetracked at the switch. The train was made up of a baggage car and two coaches. The baggage car was damaged in the head end and the engine badly smashed up. It will be taken to Denver for repairs. The freight cars were badly wrecked. Engineer Fenton's escape was miraculous. Andrew Forsman and Charles Pearson, a Denver boy, sustained injuries. Forsman had a shoulder and ribs broken. Pearson received several painful bruises and a scalp wound. They were brought to the Sisters Hospital and put under the care of Dr. Whiting. The two boy wreckers seemed to have a mania for this sort of stuff, for they threw a switch on the Bull Hill branch of the Florence and Cripple Creek near Independence later in the day. To further their designs, they placed rocks which were seen just in time by Engineer Mason of the train returning from Bull Hill, or his train would have crashed down the steep embankment at that point. The authorities were notified and Deputy O'Brien went over and brought the boys here and placed them behind bars, out of harm's way. The Midland figures its loss at something like $35,000. $35,000 in 1900 is equivalent to over $1.2 million in today's money. No small change for a relatively small railroad company. This is just one of many stories we found involving people tampering with switches or switches malfunctioning. As this article so clearly points out, switches are extremely important to railroad functionality and safety. Therefore, they must be locked so that people other than railroad workers cannot throw them and change the course of a train. So now, let's turn our attention back to the switch lock. Switch locks are special locks used to secure railroad switches in order to keep unauthorized people from throwing the switches and potentially sending a train down the wrong tracks or derailing it. Variations were also used to secure the trackside cases which housed semaphore signal mechanisms and plenty of other railroad property and equipment. Switch locks typically have a loop with a chain affixed to their base so that they can remain attached to the switch. The chain not only serves as a way to keep the lock near the switch for the ease of the operator, but it also deters theft. Today, switch locks are prized railroad collectibles. The older they are, the more collectible, as the designs of earlier locks tend to be quite ornate. In the early days of railroading, in the mid-1800s, railroad company names or reporting marks were frequently stamped onto the sides of the locks, whereas today's locks tend to be more generic-looking padlocks that look as though they could be used for virtually any device needing a lock. Switch locks are operated with specialized keys, which were made to be different from other kinds of keys so as to minimize the possibility of unauthorized users. Numerous brakemen and switchmen would need to operate the same switch. Therefore, there were many copies of the same switch key distributed to switch operators. You can imagine if there was only one key in the possession of one individual, it would be difficult to operate trains. Both early keys and early locks tended to be embossed with a railroad company's name, as well as stamped or embossed with the company that manufactured the lock itself. Sometimes locks would be stamped with just the railroad or just the manufacturer, whereas some have no markings whatsoever. We have roughly 75 different kinds of switch locks and keys in our collection at the Colorado Railroad Museum, dating from the late 1800s all the way up to the present day. The older locks tend to be brass and heart-shaped. These are highly desirable locks for collectors. We have many locks from a few specific companies, including Adams and Westlake, often abbreviated to Adlake. The Adams and Westlake Company started in 1857 in New York, eventually opening a branch in Chicago. It went through many different names due to the various ownerships and mergers it experienced. It took on the name Adams and Westlake in 1887. The company manufactured lanterns and light fixtures, as well as many different metal parts such as locks, keys, doorknobs, hooks, signs, and levers. Adams and Westlake primarily manufactured items for use in the transportation industry, but in the beginning, its products were almost exclusively for railroads. Adlake often embossed their locks with the word Adlake on the keyhole cover of the lock, as you see in these examples from the museum's collection. When the railroad name is embossed into the lock, it is known as a castback or a fancy back lock. We have very few of these prized locks in our possession, but the ones we do have are stunning, like these ones from the Denver and Rio Grande, and these ones from the Union Pacific. We believe these locks date to around the turn of the 20th century. Another company that is represented in our locks is the Handlan Company. The Handlan-Buck Company of St. Louis was one of the main suppliers of railroad lamps, lanterns, and other hardware. The company started in 1856 and was both highly respected and patronized by railroads, with its strongest markets being the Midwest and the West. It went out of business sometime in the 1990s. This lock in our collection has a great mark from Handlan, dating it to the turn of the 20th century. Perhaps one of our most prized locks is this one from the Colorado and Southern, which was founded in 1898. This lock very likely dates to the first days of this company due to its design and heavy wear. In addition to our more ornate older locks, we have many modern locks like the ones you see here. These are multi-purpose locks in the rail industry, and although many switches on today's railroads are electrically locked and thrown remotely, there are still plenty of switches to be thrown by hand when trains are switching cars and picking up or dropping off passengers to the industry sidings and so forth. As you can see, the Colorado Railroad Museum is more than just a collection of locomotives and rail cars. While switch locks are well represented in our collection, many unfortunately lack provenance, aside from their manufacturing company and the company that used them. The museum is turning over a new leaf in that we are seeking artifacts that come with more human interest stories. If you or someone you know has railroad artifacts with interesting stories connected to them, we would be delighted if you would share those stories with us and consider donating such items to our collection. We hope you've enjoyed our brief history of switch locks and the switch lock collection at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.